I find this extremely interesting. Um, Often people will bring up the early church fathers to refute Adventists. And, well, I'm not saying that they had all Adventist distinctives. Some of the crucial points of difference that many people consider heterodox notions in Adventist theology are actually pretty explicitly in the earliest church fathers. Irenaeus of Lyons was in the late 100s. He was taught by Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So we're talking, this is the Ante-Nicene fathers, so prior to the year 300. Irenaeus was 2 generations from the apostles. And if you go to his writings against the Gnostic heretics, 5 books, if you go to the 5th book, chapter 31, so what does this seem to say? He seems to be arguing with the Gnostic heretics who believed you went directly to heaven as a spirit or soul disembodied. And Irenaeus is sticking up for the resurrection of the flesh. Now, many people will read these writings and think, oh, he says this and that about the Gnostics. I don't believe that specific detail about the Gnostics. Therefore, he's not refuting me. And they dwell on those aspects, like the particular details that the Gnostics believe that he mentions, not putting the entire picture together. What's critical about this? Well, it is true that they're denying the resurrection, which many people don't deny today. But he's actually also arguing against thinking you go directly to heaven before the resurrection, which has other implications, like when is the judgment? Do people go to heaven or hell before the resurrection? So there's many things that this touches on that he's refuting, not just the particular details about the demiurge or their rejection of a physical resurrection altogether. Other things have implications here, like how the judgment fits into this. And what are the implications about what he thought the Bible's teaching about? He certainly, well, we'll talk about it. I'll read this. Chapter 31, book 5. Since again, some who are reckoned among the Orthodox go beyond the prearranged plan for the exaltation of the just and are ignorant of the methods by which they're discipled beforehand for incorruption, they thus entertain heretical opinions. For the heretics, despising the handiwork of God and not admitting the salvation of the flesh, while they also treat the promise of God contemptuously and pass beyond God altogether in the sentiments they form, affirm that immediately upon their death they shall pass above the heavens and the demiurge and go to the mother or to the father whom they have feigned. Those persons, therefore, who disallow a resurrection affecting the whole man, and as far as in them lies, remove it from the midst of the Christian scheme, how can they be wondered at if again they know nothing as to the plan of the resurrection? For they do not choose to understand that if these things are as they say, the Lord himself, in whom they profess to believe, did not rise upon the 3rd day, but immediately upon his expiring on the cross, undoubtedly departed on high, leaving his body to the earth. But the case was that for 3 days he dwelt in the place where the dead were. As the prophet says concerning him, and the Lord remembered his dead saints who slept formerly in the land of sepulture, and he descended to them to rescue and save them. And the Lord himself says, as Jonas remained 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. Then also the apostle says, but when he ascended, what is it but that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? Ephesians 4:9. This too David says when prophesying of him, you have delivered my soul from the nethermost hell. And on his rising again the 3rd day, he said to Mary, who was the first to see him and to worship him, touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to the disciples and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and unto your Father. Oh, that's like what an Adventist would argue, this heretic. This heretic in the early church, who's called a doctor of the church, who's a saint in the church, according to the Orthodox and the Catholic, He's making Adventist arguments. Jesus didn't go to heaven or to paradise the day he died, because paradise is the third heaven. That Jesus went into the heart of the earth, the place of the dead. And then he uses arguments that Adventists argue when they're trying to show modern Christians what they're getting wrong. But this guy's making the same arguments. So what's the point here? Not just that you don't go to heaven as a spirit, which these heretics denied the physical resurrection, which most Christians don't deny. But more specifically, as we'll find out in section 2 here, chapter 31, book 5, notice what else he says. If then the Lord observed the law of the dead, that he might become the first begotten from the dead, and tarried until the third day in the lower parts of the earth, then afterwards rising in the flesh, so that he even showed the print of nails to his disciples, he thus ascended to the Father in that way. If all these things occurred, then, I say, how must these men or heretics not be put to confusion when they allege the lower parts simply refers to the world of ours, and that their inner man, leaving the body here, ascends into the super celestial place? For as the Lord went away into the midst of the shadow of death, where the souls of the dead were, yet afterwards arose in the body, and after the resurrection was taken up into heaven, it is manifest that the souls also of the disciples upon whom the Lord underwent these things shall also go away into the invisible place allotted to them by God, and there remain until the resurrection, awaiting the event of the resurrection, then receiving their bodies and rising in their entirety, that is, bodily, like the Lord did. They shall thus come into the presence of the Lord. Like 1 Thessalonians 4 teaches. For no disciple is above the master, but everyone that is perfect shall be as his master. Luke 6:40. As our master, therefore, did not at once depart, taking flight to heaven, but awaited the time of his resurrection prescribed by the Father. This has been shown forth through Jonas, rising after 3 days, was taken into heaven, Jesus. So ought we also to await the time of our resurrection prescribed by God and foretold by the prophets, and so rising be taken up as many as the Lord shall account worthy of this privilege. Notice, what is he arguing against them? Just against the fact that they don't believe in a physical resurrection? No, they don't believe in that. But ultimately, what is he arguing? Because Jesus didn't go to heaven as a spirit, but not until he rose physically did he go up to the presence of the Lord. So shall also those who are stuck in the land of the dead, in the heart of the earth, they shall not come into the presence of the Lord until their appointed time. And they are like the Lord bodily resurrected, then coming into the presence of the Lord bodily resurrected after going into the place of the dead or into the heart of the earth. Because the servant is not above his master. In other words, Adventists out there, Irenaeus doesn't seem to know for sure whether or not you're conscious in the intermediate state. What's more important here is the truth about people not going into the presence of God before the resurrection. The consciousness thing is a secondary issue of less concern. Because the things that are matter here is an early church father is arguing that people didn't go to heaven when they die. They go to the place of the dead, and they don't enter the presence of the Lord until they're bodily resurrected, because that's how Jesus died and then was resurrected and didn't return to the Father until he's bodily resurrected, which is the purpose of God. This connects to the reality of the judgment, which other church fathers point out is important as well. And many Christians today argue People went to heaven and hell before and after the cross, which is so problematic, it's unbelievable. Because the only way to make sense of the verse is if they think there's so many doctrines connected in the language of Scripture and what they misunderstand, and they end up believing all sorts of things that minimize the resurrection of Jesus. Like people, like what's clear about the early church fathers, although they may have had different ideas about the conscious intermediate state, is what they didn't believe is that you come to the presence of the Lord until the resurrection in the body, just like Jesus. And I'll show other early church fathers that mentioned this too. The things that they may differ from Adventists on, we can easily show from the Bible that the Bible teaches something that they weren't sure about, and that there's disagreement in the early church fathers, like the conscious intermediate state. It depends on which verses you take as literal and what you take as in the context. But the fact is, when talking about the state of the dead, in the context of talking about life and death, the Bible is quite plain. People have to infer from stories or things that aren't teaching about the nature of the intermediate state, like Luke 16. They think it refutes our view because they take it literally, when that's not even what Jesus is teaching about per se, about the nature of the intermediate state. And then when the verses that are actually talking about the nature of the state of the dead, like it's talking about life and death and what it's like, it says plainly, the dead don't know anything. What happens after you die, do everything you can in this life, because where you're going, there is no knowledge, no praising the Lord. The living know that they will die. The dead don't know anything. That's talking about what it's like to be dead. That's the context. And people will make the Bible say something that isn't true because they infer things in a context that isn't talking about the nature of the intermediate state. It's actually not that difficult if the Bible's actually true. But because people are blinded by their made-up doctrines that their church holds, and then they project onto us who are trying to help them see what the Bible's actually teaching, that we're the cult, we're the people. It's just too much to bear. It's too easy to stay, because so many people are incorrect about this, to point and say cult. And that's why, look, Adventists will always be called a cult, because to acknowledge certain details is to say their church is wrong. So don't condemn them, and don't be scared of the threats and the claims and the misrepresentation. They're just scared. So much don't be gaslit is my point. But also don't hate people because they're scared. No disciple is above the master, but everyone that is perfect shall be as his master. Therefore, the Lord did not at once depart and take flight to heaven, but awaited the time of his resurrection, prescribed by the Father. This is fascinating. The fact of the matter is, so much of this gets distorted by the way people read this. Let's see. The things that they may not agree with Adventists on are the things that are the easiest to show from Scripture, a careful reading of Scripture too. So it's interesting. But I find it fascinating that somebody was saying like Adventists are a cult, like miles from answering Adventism, and you go back and you read the things that they're actually refuting, and I'm going, wow, who's the cult now? Okay, people aren't sure about the consciousness of the intermediate state, but the other things, like the judgment hasn't happened yet. You don't go to heaven as when you die, and it won't happen till the end, which is very consistent regarding the doctrine of final judgment, which is also easily proved from Scripture. But in other things, this guy is refuting in his in this early church father who's saying fighting heretics. He also mentions how these heretics essentially were teaching that you don't have free will, kind of like the Presbyterians, like Miles' church's teaches. He's refuting those very distinctions that many Calvinists seem to believe in fighting the heretics and people who are like free grace. Not to mention, but of course, many of Protestants that disagree with Adventists, their catechisms say, like, the commandments, just like this same author, which I should read next here. Let's see. The Gnostics believed you went directly to heaven when you die, that Jesus and the Father are different gods because essentially just believing a doctrine and not having righteous, actual, obedience to God is not necessary, but just believing this special knowledge makes you saved and you can't lose your salvation. He fought against them, saying you couldn't apostatize, and he called them apostates because they thought by having their special, like essentially having some sort of propositional secret knowledge made them so that they couldn't be lost. And they held that you didn't have to be righteous. You just had to have this special knowledge, like believe the right doctrine and you're good, and that you couldn't be lost. They fought him for that reason. And these people thought you went directly to heaven without your body and obscured the resurrection and the judgment. And they fought against these men who denied that men were free. All men were free, and that God wanted all men to be saved, and that the men who aren't saved are not lost because of their own nature, but because they rejected the truth. So he literally argues against the distinctions that people say Adventists are heretics for, are distinct doctrines. He believed in those. He believed that hell was annihilation. He believed that people who taught once saved, always saved, and that propositional knowledge saved them were heretics. And he also taught that hell is annihilationism. And he also taught that people who said people were evil by their nature, basically born unable to believe, that people who said that were heretics. And he also affirms that the Decalogue is forever binding on all humans. Who does that? I mean, I would say that Irenaeus is more Adventist than Presbyterian or Baptist as far as the specific theological things that people argue with Adventists about. So, like, if he didn't keep the Sabbath, I don't really care. I'm not even sure he didn't, but the principles of what he was saying about the Decalogue, Adventists would agree with. His principles of free will, Adventists would agree with. The necessity of continuing in the faith and having righteous behavior was necessary, and that all men could and were desired by God to do that, and the ones who didn't made that choice on their own, not based on their nature, but because they reject the truth. So it's actually quite funny that people, the problems people have with Adventist theology, it's quite fascinating.